Chapter 19, Musculoskeletal System. Chapter 19 is all about the structure and function of the bones and the muscles. This first picture is showing the anatomy of the bone. It shows the structure of the bone internally and some of the components. As you can see, the long bones, which are bones that are longer than they are wide, are composed of spongy bone at the end, which is known as the epiphysis, and spongy bone is unorganized appearing tissue. There are numerous thin plates surrounded by unequal spaces. The plates follow the lines of stress, so spongy bone is quite strong. The spaces are filled with red bone marrow. Red bone marrow produces blood cells. In infants, red bone marrow is present in cavities of all bones. There is a more limited number of bones in adults that contain red bone marrow. Those include the ends of the long bones, the flat bones, such as the pelvis, the skull, the sternum, and also the irregular bones of the vertebrae. Along the midline of the bone is the diaphysis. This part of the bone is made up of compact bone. Compact bone is highly organized. It's composed of osteons. These are tubular structures. Within the osteons are osteocytes, which are bone cells that lie in lacunae. Compact bone has a mineralized matrix, also containing collagen fibers. These collagen fibers and matrix fill the spaces between the lacunae, which are chambers. In the center is a central canal, which contains blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. Caniculi connect lacunae with each other and also with the central canal. Also, you can see the hyaline cartilage, which is found at the joints. Here is a picture of one of the osteons, which does have the osteocytes or bone cells inside of the lacunae or chambers, and then the little central canal, which contains the blood vessels and the nerves. Cartilage is not quite as strong as bone, but it is more flexible. The matrix is also not as rigid. It's a gel. This gel contains many collagenous and elastic fibers. Cartilage has no blood vessels, so it is very slow to heal. There are three types of cartilage. The first type is hyaline cartilage, which is the most common type within the body. Hyaline cartilage is firm and somewhat flexible. It's going to be found at the ends of the long bones, the nose, the ends of the ribs, the larynx or voice box, and the trachea. Second type is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is stronger. It's composed of thick collagen fibers, and it can withstand both pressure and tension. It's going to be found in places like the intervertebral disc and also the knees. The final type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is the most flexible, made almost entirely of elastin fibers. This type of cartilage is going to be found in the ear flaps and the epiglottis. Throughout the life, bone is consistently being broken down and built back up again. This is called remodeling. During this process, osteoclasts break down bone matrix and release calcium into the blood. Osteoclasts are going to respond to hormones that we talked about in chapter 20. Osteoblasts are the builders. These cells pick up calcium from the blood and deposit it into the new bone matrix. These guys are the ones that get trapped in the matrix and become osteocytes or bone cells within the lacunae. This remodeling process can change the thickness of the bone. Bone remodeling is going to be affected by hormones such as calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, and also by physical use. One of the other processes that affects bone development and growth is called echondral ossification. Most bones of the human skeleton first appear as hyaline cartilage, the exception being the skull bones. During echondral ossification, hyaline cartilage templates form first. So you can see the cartilaginous model over here. The cartilage breaks down in the center, and the periosteum, or covering around the bone, develops. Osteoblasts migrate in and produce spongy bone in what's called the primary ossification center. Other osteoblasts then produce compact bone beneath the periosteum. Osteoclasts break down the spongy bone, creating the medullary or central cavity. The ends of the long bones continue to grow. Secondary ossification centers start to develop, as seen here. In the secondary ossification center, spongy bone forms and does not break down. The growth plate remains between primary ossification center and each secondary ossification center. And you can see the primary growth plate right here and also along the bottom. The limbs keep increasing in length as long as the growth plates are present. Eventually, the growth plates ossify and the bones stop growing. The skeleton's job is to support the body, primarily. However, it also protects the soft body parts. It produces the blood cells. It stores minerals and fat. Along with muscles, it permits flexible body movement. The skeleton is... The skeleton bones are classified according to where they lie. The axial skeleton is found along the midline of the body. The appendicular skeleton are the bones of the limbs and the limb girdles. Think appendages. These bones are going to be further classified according to their shape. Long bones are bones that are longer than they are wide. Short bones are cube-shaped bones. Flat bones are flat like a dinner plate. Irregular bones have no particular size. Round bones, like the kneecap or patella, are circular. All bones have depressions and protuberances or processes for attachment of muscles, openings for nerves, and or blood vessels to pass through. Collectively, there are approximately 206 bones in the human body. In blue is the axial skeleton along the midline of the body. The skull and facial bones, the vertebrae along the back, the ribs and the sternum in the front. In off-white are the appendicular skeleton bones, the bones of the arm and shoulder, hands and wrists, hips, legs, ankles, and feet. For the test, make sure you're familiar with those bones that we discussed in class. The axial skeleton is going to be composed of the skull, the cranium, the facial bones. In adults, the skull is made of 8 bones fitted tightly together. The job of the cranium is to protect the brain. In infants, there is incomplete ossification. This is to facilitate childbirth. There are places of membranous regions, which are called fontanelles, that usually close by the age of 24 months. Also within the cranium are sinuses. Sinuses are open air spaces lined by mucous membranes. They reduce the weight of the skull and give a resonant sound to the voice. 2 sinuses, which are called the mastoid sinuses, drain into the middle ear. The bones are named for the lobes of the brain. In the front, the bone that forms the forehead is called the frontal bone. Along the sides of the brain case are the parietal bones, and there are 2 of those, one on either side. The temporal bone is below the parietal bone. It's easily identified by the external auditory canal, which leads to the eardrum. The occipital bone is at the base of the skull, in the back here. The foramen magnum, which is a giant hole in the bottom of the brain, case for the spinal cord to pass through is found in this occipital bone. The sphenoid bone is the floor of the cranium, and the sphenoid bone resembles a bat with its wings outstretched. And then the ethmoid bone, which you can barely see peeking in red, also forms part of the cranium, the orbits of the eyes, and the nasal septum. Facial bones include the mandible, which forms the chin. This is the only movable bone of the skull. It has modified structures known as tooth sockets to facilitate your teeth. The maxilla, which is the upper jaw, maxilla also contains tooth sockets and forms the front portion of the hard palate and the floor of the nose. The vomer bone and the ethmoid bones are part of the nasal septum, which divide the nose into two cavities. Here. Zygomatic bones are going to form the cheeks. These are known as your cheekbones. Nasal bones contain nasolacrimal canals, which bring tears from the eyes to the nose, which is again why your nose runs every time you cry. The temporal and facial bones are also the bones of the cranium, but they contribute to the shape of the face as well. So temporal again is going to be on the sides of the head where your ears are located, and then that frontal bone is the forehead. Another bone of interest in the head and neck is the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is the only bone in the body which does not articulate with another bone. It has membranous attachment to the larynx and to the temporals by muscles and ligaments. It is the bone that anchors the tongue and attaches muscles associated with swallowing. Our next section of the axial skeleton is the vertebral column. The vertebral column is composed of 33 vertebrae. These vertebrae naturally form 4 curvatures. However, sometimes these curvatures are exaggerated, or there are additional curves which are not supposed to be there. Scoliosis is abnormal lateral or sideways curvature of the spine. This can be corrected as long as it's found early in life. Kyphosis is abnormal posterior curvature that results in a hunchback. Lordosis is abnormal anterior curvature resulting in a swayback. The spinal cord passes through the vertebral canal as well, and spinal nerves exit through the intervertebral foramina. Spinous processes of the vertebrae, which are bony projections along the back, and transverse processes serve as attachment sites for muscles that move the vertebral column, or the back. There are different types of vertebrae as we move down the vertebral column. The first 7 vertebrae are known as cervical vertebrae. The first 2 are specialized. The atlas holds up the head and allows you to nod yes and tilt your head. The axis is going to allow you to nod your head to make a no motion. Those are the first 2. The remaining cervical vertebrae are known as C3, C4, C5, C6, and C7. The next 12 vertebrae are known as thoracic vertebrae. These have articular faucets to articulate with the ribs. They also have very prominent spinous processes. The next 5 vertebrae are lumbar vertebrae or lower back vertebrae. Lumbar vertebrae along this lower back region have large bodies and thick processes for lots of muscle attachment. The next 5 vertebrae are called sacral vertebrae, or collectively known as the sacrum. These are 5 fused vertebrae in the adult form, and they allow for pelvic curvature. The last 3 to 5 vertebrae are also fused to form the tailbone or the coccyx. Let me back up. Between the vertebrae are pads of fibrocartilage. Intervertebral discs provide the padding to keep these bones from rubbing against each other and also to absorb shock. However, the intervertebral discs can herniate and rupture, causing pain, and they may have to be removed or fused to relieve pressure on the spinal cord. Our next section of the axial skeleton is the rib cage or thoracic cage. The rib cage or thoracic cage is composed of thoracic vertebrae, ribs, and associated cartilages, as well as the sternum or chest bone in the front. The ribs originate at the thoracic vertebra in the back and proceed around to the anterior thoracic wall. The job of the rib cage is to protect the heart and the lungs, but they are flexible to allow for breathing. When damaged, they can cause pain and intense damage to the lungs if fractured. The first 7 pair of ribs are known as the true ribs. They articulate directly with the sternum by means of a cartilage. The next 3 pair are known as false ribs. False ribs join into a common cartilage, and then that one cartilage joins the 3 to the sternum. And the last 2 pair are called floating ribs. They do not articulate with the sternum at all. The sternum or the breastbone helps protect the heart and lungs as well. It's a flat bone shaped like a knife, and it's formed by 3 bones that fuse during fetal development. The first part is known as the manubrium or the handle. It articulates with the clavicle or collarbone and also the first pair of ribs. The second part is known as the body. This is the point of junction between the manubrium and the body that's an important landmark for medical healthcare professionals. It identifies the second pair of ribs. This allows these healthcare professionals to count the ribs to determine where the apex of the heart is. The final portion of the sternum or breastbone is known as the xiphoid process, or the point of the blade. It has a process for the attachment of the diaphragm muscle. Moving now to our appendicular skeleton. These are going to be the bones of the arms and the legs and their associated girdles. The pectoral girdle, or upper limb girdles, are specialized for flexibility, whereas the lower limb girdle is specialized for strength. The first bone that we have in the pectoral or shoulder girdle is known as the clavicle or collarbone. The clavicle articulates with the sternum and the acromion process of the scapula, so it extends across the top of the thorax or the chest. Our second bone is the scapula. Scapula is a bone external to the ribs in back, and there are muscles of the arm and chest that are attached to different portions of the scapula. The scapula contains the glenoid cavity, which articulates with the humerus, the upper arm bone, to form the shoulder joint, which is known as the rotator cuff. The coracoid process is the point of arm and chest muscle attachment. And finally, the spine of the scapula is for muscle attachments in the shoulders and the upper arm. This joint, where the arm and the shoulder meet, the rotator cuff, is a joint that is flexible in almost any direction, but it is the most easily dislocated joint in the body. Our upper arm or upper limb bone is known as the humerus. The humerus has a smoothly rounded head and a protuberance where the deltoid or shoulder muscle attaches. The far end of the humerus has 2 protuberances, the capitulum and the trochlea, which articulate with the radius and ulna, respectively, at the elbow. The elbow is actually the olecranon process of the ulna. The ulna extends from the elbow to the pinky side of your hand, and the radius extends from the inner arm all the way down to the thumb side of the hand. In the wrist, there are 8 carpal bones. They look like small pebbles and are designed for flexibility and dexterity. There are 5 bones that make up the metacarpals. They form the palm of the hand. The thumb is also a metacarpal. It's opposable to the other 4. Your knuckles are enlarged distal ends of the metacarpals. And finally, the phalanges, which are the bones of your fingers, or digits. Phalanges in the hand are long and slender and lightweight, also designed for flexibility and dexterity. And here you see those bones. The pelvic girdle is also known as the hip girdle, and it is composed of 2 large, heavy coxal bones, or hip bones, that meet in the mental. Collectively, this is known as the pelvis. The pelvis is made up of the pelvic girdle, the sacrum, and the coccyx. Its job is to protect the internal organs, bear the weight of the body, and it serves as an attachment for the lower limbs. The 2 coxal bones are composed of 3 bones that fused during development, for a total of 6 bones. The ilium is the largest of the 3. It's the flared top portion. The ischium is in the back of the pelvic girdle. It has a posterior spine called the ischial spine. And the pubis is in the front of the pelvic girdle. It's fused with the opposite side of the pelvic girdle at the pubic symphysis. Male and female pelvises differ. In females, the ilia are more flared, the pelvic cavity is broader, and the outlet is wider to facilitate childbirth. And here are your bones of the lower limbs. The lower limb is going to begin with the femur, which is the largest bone in the body. It begins at the hip and moves to the knee. The head of the femur is rounded and articulates with the coxal bones at the acetabulum. It has 2 large processes called the greater and lesser trochanter, which are for muscle attachment, which these muscles are going to be found in the thigh muscles and the muscles of the buttocks. At distal end, the medial and lateral condyles are protuberances that articulate with the tibia. The tibia is the weight-bearing bone of the lower leg, also known as the shin bone. At the distal end, the medial malleolus of the tibia causes the inner bulge of the ankle. The patella is the kneecap. It is held in place by the quadriceps tendon, and which continues as a ligament that attaches to the tibial tuberosity. The fibula is a smaller bone on the lateral or outside of the tibia. The tibia has a prominence called the lateral malleolus that forms the outer bulge of the ankle. This bone is a stabilizing bone, not a load-bearing bone. There are 7 bones in the ankle known as tarsal bones. One of those being the talus. The talus is where the tibia and fibula meet the ankle. And also, another important bone of the ankle is known as the calcaneus muscle, calcaneus bone, which is the heel. There are 5 bones that make up the instep of the foot, which are known as metatarsals. If the ligaments that bind the metatarsals become weakened, you become flat-footed, which is hard on the spine and the hips. The phalanges, which are the bones of the toes, are stout and extremely sturdy, more for load-bearing than flexibility. Now we'll move into joints. Joints are divided into different types according to their movability and flexibility. The first type are fibrous or immovable joints. Immovable joints are going to include the sutures between the bones of the skull, where those bones have fused during development. Second type are cartilaginous joints. These are slightly movable. They're connected to other bones or to themselves by hyaline cartilage. The places in the chest where the ribs meet the sternum are examples of cartilaginous, slightly movable joints. There are also fibrocartilaginous joints, like the intervertebral discs between the bones of the spine. And finally, we have synovial joints, which are freely movable. Synovial joints are lined with synovial membrane, which produces synovial fluid to lubricate the joints. Major synovial joints are going to include the shoulder, elbow, hip, and knee. These bones are separated by a cavity, and the ligaments that hold the two bones in place are going to form a capsule. There are generally tendons to help stabilize that joint. And there are several types of synovial joints. The first type is a hinge joint. Hinge joints permit movement in only one direction, for example, the knee or the elbow. Pivot joints permit rotational movement. The joint between the radius and the ulna in the lower arm allows the arm to rotate. And finally, ball and socket joints, which permit movement in all planes, like the hip or the shoulder joints. Ball and socket joints are extremely flexible. However, again, they are very, very easy to dislocate. Here's our picture of the knee joint. The knee contains menisci, or crescent-shaped pieces of hyaline cartilage between the bones to give stability and act as shock absorbers. They are easily injured. It's known as a torn cartilage. There are also anterior and posterior ligaments to help stabilize the knee by attaching it to the femur. These are also prone to being torn. The knee contains 13 fluid-filled sacs called bursae. These ease the friction between the tendons and the ligaments. Some people experience inflammation of the bursae, which is known as bursitis, or tennis elbow. The next section of the chapter focuses on skeletal muscles. Remember, humans have three types of muscle tissue: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. Skeletal muscle is the one that makes up the highest percentage in the body. It is voluntary muscle, meaning you control it. Skeletal muscle is covered by connective tissue, which is called fascia, and the fascia extends beyond the muscle to become its tendon and attach it to the bone. When a skeletal muscle contracts, one bone remains fairly stationary. That's known as the origin spot of the muscle. The other bone moves, and that's known as the insertion of the muscle. Frequently, parts are moved by groups of muscles working together, with one muscle doing most of the work, the prime mover, and assisting muscles, or synergists, helping out. Generally, muscles work in antagonistic pairs as well. Antagonistic pairs bring about movement in opposite directions. There are over 650 human skeletal muscles. Their names vary, but generally they tell you something about the muscle. For example, if the word contains maximus, that means largest. Gluteus maximus is the largest muscle in the buttocks region. It can also tell you shape. For example, the deltoid bone in the upper arm has the shape of a triangle. The delta, or triangle, is a Greek letter in their alphabet. The name could also tell you location. The example is the frontalis muscle. Frontalis muscle overlies the frontal bone of the skull, which sits over the frontal lobe of the brain. Could tell you the direction of the muscle fibers. For example, rectus means straight, so rectus abdominis are straight muscles along the abdomen. The name could tell you the number of attachments. Biceps means 2, so biceps brachii has 2 attachment points in the upper arm. Or it could tell you the action. The extensor digitorum muscle extends the digits. Make sure you're familiar with the skeletal muscles that we discussed in lab class, including the orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris, frontalis, masseter, sternocleidomastoid, trapezius, deltoid, pectoralis major, latissimus dorsi, biceps brachii, triceps brachii, rectus abdominis, external oblique, quadriceps muscles in the leg, tibialis anterior, gastrocnemius, hamstrings, gluteus maximus, and also, don't forget, the Achilles tendon. Table 19.2 in the book and 19.3 as well are going to give you names and actions of the different muscles found inside the body. It's a very useful tool when studying for the test. A muscle fiber is known to be a muscle cell. Has the usual cellular components, however the names have changed because we are in a muscle cell now rather than a regular body cell. The myofibrils are contractile portions. Glycogen is sugar for energy storage. Myoglobin stores oxygen. And myofibrils contain sarcomeres. Sarcomeres are contractile units. The plasma membrane of the muscle fiber, or muscle cell, is known as the sarcolemma, and the cytoplasm is the sarcoplasm. The endoplasmic reticulum is known as the sarcoplasmic reticulum in muscle cells. So you can see the same cellular components with a different name. Table 19.4 lists those names and also the function. Our next figure demonstrates a neuromuscular junction. Neuromuscular junctions are the places where a neuron from the nervous system meets a muscle fiber. One motor neuron can synapse with few or many muscle fibers in a muscle. Each axon has axon branches that end in an axon terminal. There is a neuromuscular junction between the two. They don't exactly touch. There is a gap between them. The axon terminal contains synaptic vessels filled with acetylcholine. When the nerve impulse reaches the end of the axon, acetylcholine is released into the synaptic cleft. Acetylcholine diffuses across the cleft and binds to receptors in the sarcolemma. Botox, or botulinum toxin A, is a toxin produced by bacterium that prevents the release of acetylcholine, so the muscles cannot contract. When it's time for the muscle to contract, there is a series of reactions that occurs. Tropomyosin threads wind about actin. Troponin is located at intervals along the actin. When calcium is released, it binds to the troponin, causes the tropomyosin threads to shift position. The globular heads of the myosin have ATP binding sites. ATPase splits ATP into ADP and a phosphate. The heads now bind to sites on the actin. ADP and phosphate are released from the myosin and the cross bridges change positions, known as the power stroke. This causes the actin filaments to slide, or contraction to occur. Relaxation occurs when the impulses stop and calcium is actively transported into the sarcoplasmic reticulum.
An action potential introduced at the neuromuscular junction is propagated along the sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle. At the T-tubule, the action potential is propagated on the T-tubule membrane into the interior of the muscle cell near the ends of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The depolarization of the T-tubule membrane causes nearby voltage-gated calcium ion channels on the sarcoplasmic reticulum to open, resulting in an increase in the permeability of the sarcoplasmic reticulum to calcium ions. Calcium ions then diffuse from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the sarcoplasm. Long filamentous tropomyosin proteins lie on two sides of the actin myofilament, covering up the sites where myosin can bind to the actin myofilament. Globular troponin proteins are attached to the tropomyosin. When calcium ions bind to troponin, this causes troponin to change conformation and move the tropomyosin. When the tropomyosin moves, this uncovers the myosin-binding sites on the actin, allowing myosin heads to bind and form cross bridges. The cross bridges play a role in muscle contraction.
As stated, the muscles need ATP in order to contract. Muscles acquire new ATP in three ways: creatine phosphate breakdown, cellular respiration, and fermentation. Creatine phosphate breakdown is a way to acquire ATP before oxygen starts entering the mitochondria. It's an anaerobic process, meaning there's no oxygen. Cellular respiration takes place when oxygen is present, an aerobic process. And fermentation is also an anaerobic process that begins once the oxygen reserves have been used up in a muscle cell. Creatine phosphate is a high-energy compound. It builds up at rest. It is the fastest way to make ATP available for the muscle cells. However, it only provides energy for about 8 seconds of intense activity. After that, we rely on another mechanism to gain ATP. Creatine phosphate can be rebuilt by transferring a phosphate group from ATP to creatine. Cellular respiration provides most of the energy for muscle contraction. The muscle cell uses glucose from glycogen and fatty acids from fat in cellular respiration pathway. This process occurs in the mitochondria and does require oxygen. Muscle cells have myoglobin, a red pigment. It has a higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin, so it allows the muscles to store oxygen temporarily. At the end of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide is produced and then removed by the lungs. Water is removed by the bloodstream, and heat is generated and used to keep the body warm to maintain homeostasis. Once the oxygen reserves have been depleted in a muscle cell, fermentation begins. Fermentation supplies ATP without oxygen. During this process, glucose is broken down into lactate or lactic acid. Lactic acid builds up in the cells and makes the cytoplasm more acidic. Eventually, the enzymes cease to function well. If fermentation continues for more than 2 to 3 minutes, cramping and fatigue occur from lack of ATP to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This breaks the linkages between the actin and myosin filaments and allows the muscle fibers to relax. One of the problems associated with fermentation is oxygen debt. Oxygen debt causes a person to continue to breathe heavily after finished exercising. Oxygen debt occurs when a muscle uses creatine phosphate of fermentation to supply its energy needs. This is important because it allows the blood glucose to be spared for the brain. Anytime you're in debt, you have to repay what you've taken. So during the repaying of oxygen debt, you replenish the creatine phosphate supplies and also dispose the lactate that is built up in the muscle cells. This lactate is either metabolized in the mitochondria or sent to the liver to be reconstructed as glycogen. There is a correlation between exercise and the size of the muscles. Muscles that are not used are going to decrease in size. This is called atrophy. If stimulation is not restored to these muscles that are not being used, the muscle fibers gradually are replaced by fat and fibrous tissues. This can cause the muscle fibers to shorten progressively, having body parts contracted in contorted positions. This is also why you see coma patients and patients who are paralyzed still receiving physical therapy, where the arms and the legs and other muscle groups are activated and moved by a nurse or a doctor. to keep those muscles from atrophy. Forceful activity over a prolonged time causes the muscle to increase in size. This is called hypertrophy. Hypertrophy only occurs if a muscle contracts to at least 75% of its maximum tension. This process increases the number of myofibrils within the fibers. There are different types of muscle fibers: slow twitch fibers and fast twitch muscle fibers. Slow twitch fibers provide a steadier tug, and they're known for more endurance. These are going to be helpful for long distance running, jogging, biking, or swimming. Slow twitch fibers produce the most energy aerobically with cellular respiration. They have many mitochondria and are dark in color from all the myoglobin used to store the oxygen. They have a low maximum tension, which develops slowly, so it takes a while for these muscle groups to get going. And they have substantial reserves of glycogen and fat to allow them to continue on. Fast twitch muscle fibers are anaerobic fibers. They develop their maximum tension very rapidly, and these are going to be designed for strength. They provide explosions of energy. They're helpful for sprinting, weightlifting, golfing, or throwing a shot. Some activity that only needs a burst of energy and then a rest period. The dependence of fast twitch fibers on anaerobic energy leaves them vulnerable to an accumulation of lactic acid and fatigue. So here you can see the slow twitch fibers, which are dark, and the fast twitch fibers, which are light. End of the chapter is going to discuss disorders of the musculoskeletal systems. Bones are susceptible to being broken or fractured due to trauma. If the skin is punctured, it's known as an open fracture. Otherwise, it's closed. There are different types of fractures. Green stick fractures do not pass all the way through the bone. It's more of a crack. Stress fractures are small cracks in the bones, generally lower leg bones, because the muscle has become fatigued and it's unable to absorb the shock of athletic activities. Compound fractures result in 3 or more pieces of bone.